Chapter 14 of Old Time Makers of Medicine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adam Marcetich, September 2009, Alexandria, Virginia. Old Time Makers of Medicine by James Joseph. Chapter 14, Part 2 of 2. It was not only in Italy, however, that there was a wonderful outburst of genius at this time, for Germany also saw the rise of a number of great men during this period. Jacob Wimpfeling, the schoolmaster of Germany, as he has been called, whose educational work did much to determine the character of German education for 2 centuries, was born in 1450. Rudolf Agricola, who influenced the intellectual Europe of his time deeply, was born in 1443. Erasmus, one of the greatest of scholars, of teachers, and of controversialists, was born in 1467. Johann Reuchlin, the great linguist, who, next to Erasmus, is the most important character in the German Renaissance, was born in 1455. Then there was Sebastian Brandt, the author of The Ship of Fools, and Alexander Hagius, both of this same period. The most influential of them all, Thomas A. Kempis, who died in 1471, and whose little book, The Following of Christ, has influenced every generation deeply ever since, was probably a close contemporary of Basil Valentine. When one knows of what European, and especially German scholars, were accomplishing at this time, no room is left for surprise that Basil Valentine should have lived and done work in medicine at this period that was to influence deeply the after history of medicine. Most of what Basil Valentine did was accomplished in the first half of the 15th century, coming, as he did, before the invention of printing, when the spirit of tradition was more rife and dominating than it has been since. It is almost needless to say that there are many curious legends associated with his name. 2 centuries before his time, Roger Bacon, doing his work in England, had succeeded in attracting so much attention even from the common people, because of his wonderful scientific discoveries, that his name became a byword, and many strange magical feats were attributed to him. Friar Bacon was the great wizard, even in the plays of the Elizabethan period. A number of the same sort of myths attached themselves to the Benedictine monk of the 15th century. He was proclaimed in popular story to have been a wonderful magician. Even his manuscript, it was said, had not been published directly, but had been hidden in a pillar in the church attached to his monastery, and had been discovered there after the splitting open of the pillar by a bolt of lightning from heaven. It is the extension of this tradition that has sometimes led to the assumption that Valentine lived in an earlier century, some even going so far as to say that he, too, like Roger Bacon, was the product of the 13th century. It seems reasonably possible, however, to separate the traditional from what is actual in his existence, and thus to obtain some idea at least of his work, if not of the details of his life. The internal evidence from his works enables the historian of science to place his writing within a half-century of the discovery of America. One of the myths that have gathered around the name of Basil Valentine, because it has become a commonplace in philology, has probably made him more generally known than any of his actual discoveries. In one of the most popular of the old-fashioned textbooks of chemistry in use about half a century ago, in the chapter on antimony, there was a story that students, if I may judge from my own experience, never forgot. It was said that Basil Valentine, a monk of the Middle Ages, was the discoverer of this substance. After having experimented with it a number of ways, he threw some of it out of his laboratory one day, when the swine of the monastery, finding it, proceeded to gobble it up, together with some other refuse. Just when they were finishing it, the monk discovered what they were doing. He feared the worst from it, but took the occasion to observe the effect upon the swine very carefully. He found that, after a preliminary period of digestive disturbance, these swine developed an enormous appetite, and became fatter than any of the others. This seemed a rather desirable result, and Basil Valentine, ever on the search for the practical, thought that he might use the remedy to good purpose on the members of the community. Some of the monks of the monastery were of rather frail health and delicate constitution, and most of them were rather thin, and he thought that the putting on of a little fat, provided it could be accomplished without infringement of the rule, might be a good thing for them. Accordingly, he administered, surreptitiously, some of the salts of antimony with which he was experimenting in the food served to these monks. The result, however, was not so favorable as in the case of the hogs. Indeed, according to one, though less authentic, version of the story, some of the poor monks, the unconscious subjects of the experiment, perished as the result of the ingestion of the antimonial compounds. According to the better version, they suffered only the usual unpleasant consequences of taking antimony, which are, however, quite enough for a fitting climax to the story. Basil Valentine called the new substance which he had discovered antimony, that is, opposed to monks. It might be good for hogs, but it was a form of monk's bane, as it were. Unfortunately for most of the good stories of history, modern criticism has nearly always failed to find any authentic basis for them, and they have had to go the way of the legends of Washington's hatchet and Tell's apple. We are sorry to say that seems to be true also of this particular story. Antimony, the word, is probably derived from certain dialectic forms of the Greek word for the metal, and the name is no more derived from anti and monachus than it is from anti and monos, opposed to single existence. Another fictitious derivation that has been suggested, and one whose etymological value is supposed to consist in the fact that antimony is practically never found alone in nature. Notwithstanding the apparent cloud of unfounded traditions that are associated with his name, there can be no doubt at all of the fact that Valentinus, to give him the Latin name by which he is commonly designated in foreign literatures, was one of the great geniuses who, working in obscurity, make precious steps into the unknown that enable humanity after them to see things more clearly than ever before. There are definite historical grounds for placing Basil Valentine as the first of the series of careful observers who differentiated chemistry from the old alchemy and applied its precious treasures of information to the uses of medicine. It is said to have been because of the study of Basil Valentine's work that Paracelsus broke away from the Galenic traditions, so supreme in medicine up to his time, and began our modern pharmaceutics. Following Paracelsus came von Helmont, the father of modern medical chemistry, and these three did more than any others to enlarge the scope of medication and to make observation, rather than authority, the most important criterion of truth in medicine. Indeed, the work of this trio of men of the 15th and 16th centuries, the Renaissance in medicine as in art, dominated medical treatment, or at least the department of pharmaceutics, down almost to our own day, and their influence is still felt in drug giving. While we do not know the absolute data of either the birth or the death of Basil Valentine, and are not sure of the exact period even in which he lived and did his work, we are sure that a great original observer about the time of the invention of printing studied mercury and sulfur and various salts of the metals, and above all introduced antimony to the notice of the scientific world, and especially to the favor of practitioners of medicine. His book, The Triumphal Chariot of Antimony, is full of conclusions not quite justified by his premises nor by his observations. There is no doubt, however, that the observational method which he employed furnished an immense amount of knowledge, and formed the basis of the method of investigation by which the chemical side of medicine was to develop during the next 2 or 3 centuries. Great harm was done by the abuse of antimony, but then great harm is done by the abuse of anything, no matter how good it may be. For a time it came to be the most important drug in medicine, and was only replaced by venesection. The fact of the matter is that doctors were looking for effects from their drugs, and antimony is, above all things, effective. Patients, too, wished to see the effect of the medicines they took. They do so even yet, and when antimony was administered, there was no doubt about its working. The most interesting of Basil Valentine's books, and the one which has had the most enduring influence, is undoubtedly The Triumphal Chariot of Antimony. It has been translated, and has had a wide vogue in every language of modern Europe. Its recommendation of antimony had such an effect upon medical practice that it continued to be the most important drug in the pharmacopoeia down almost to the middle of the 19th century. If any proof were needed that Basil Valentine, or that the author of the books that go under the name, was a monk, it would be found in the introduction to this volume, which not only states that fact very clearly, but also in doing so makes use of language that shows the writer to have been deeply imbued with the old monastic spirit. I quote the first paragraph of this introduction because it emphasizes this. The quotation is taken from the English translation of the work as published in London in 1678. Curiously enough, seeing the obscurity surrounding Valentine himself, we do not know for sure who made the translation. The translator apologizes somewhat for the deeply religious spirit of the book, but considers that he was not justified in eliminating any of this. The paragraph is left in the quaint, old-fashioned form, so eminently suited to the thoughts of the old master, and the spelling and use of capitals is not changed. Quote, Basil Valentine, his triumphant chariot of antimony. Since I, Basil Valentine, by religious vows am bound to live according to the order of Saint Benedict, and that requires another manner of spirit of holiness than the common state of mortals exercised in the profane business of this world, I thought it my duty before all things, in the beginning of this little book, to declare what is necessary to be known by the pious spagyrist, old-time name for medical chemist, inflamed with an ardent desire of this art as what he ought to do, and whereunto to direct his striving, that he may lay such foundations of the whole matter as may be stable, lest his building, shaken with the winds, happen to fall, and the whole edifice be involved in shameful ruin, which otherwise being founded on more firm and solid principles, might have continued for a long series of time. Which admonition I judged was, and is always will be necessary part of my religious office, especially since we must all die, and no one of us which are now, whether high or low, shall long be seen among the number of men. For it concerns me to recommend these meditations of mortality to posterity, leaving them behind me, not only that honor may be given to the divine majesty, but also that men may obey him sincerely in all things. In this my meditation I found that there were 5 principal heads, chiefly to be considered by the wise and prudent spectators of our wisdom and art. The first of which is invocation of God, the second, contemplation of nature, the third, true preparation, the fourth, the way of using, the fifth, utility and fruit. For he who regards not these shall never obtain place among true chemists or fill up the number of perfect spagyrists. Therefore, touching these 5 heads, we shall here following treat and so far declare them, as that the general work may be brought to light and perfected by an intent and studious operator." This book, though the title might seem to indicate it, is not devoted entirely to the study of antimony, but contains many important additions to the chemistry of the time. For instance, Basil Valentine explains in this work how what he calls the spirit of salt might be obtained. He succeeded in manufacturing this material by treating common salt with oil of vitriol and heat. From the description of the uses to which he put the end product of his chemical manipulation, it is evident that under the name of spirit of salt he is describing what we now know as hydrochloric acid. This is said to be the first definite mention of it in the history of science, and the method suggested for its preparation is not very difficult from that employed even at the present time. He also suggests in his volume how alcohol may be obtained in high strengths. He distilled a spirit obtained from wine over carbonate of potassium, and thus succeeded in depriving it of a great proportion of its water. We have said that he was deeply interested in the philosopher's stone. Naturally this turned his attention to the study of metals, and so it is not surprising to find that he succeeded in formulating a method by which metallic copper could be obtained. The material used for this purpose was copper pyrites, which was changed to an impure sulfate of copper by the action of oil of vitriol and moist air. The sulfate of copper occurred in solution, and the copper could be precipitated from it by plunging an iron bar into it. Basil Valentine recognized the presence of this peculiar yellow metal, and studied some of its qualities. He does not seem to have been quite sure, however, whether the phenomenon that he witnessed was not really a transmutation, at least of some of the iron into copper, as a consequence of the other chemicals present. There are some observations on chemical physiology, and especially with regard to respiration, in the book on antimony which show their author to have anticipated the true explanation of the theory of respiration. He states that animals breathe because air is needed to support their life, and that all the animals exhibit the phenomenon of respiration. He even insists that the fishes, though living in water, breathe air, and he adduces in support of this idea the fact that whenever a river is entirely frozen, the fishes die. The reason for this being, according to this old-time physiological chemist, not that the fishes are frozen to death, but that they are not able to obtain air in the ice as they did in the water, and consequently perish. There are many testimonials to the practical character of all his knowledge and his desire to apply it for the benefit of humanity. The old monk could not repress the expression of his impatience with physicians who gave to patients for "diseases of which they knew little, remedies of which they knew less." For him it was an unpardonable sin for a physician not to have faithfully studied the various mixtures that he prescribed for his patients, and not to know not only their appearance and taste and effect, but also the limits of their application. Considering that at the present time it is a frequent source of complaint that physicians often prescribe remedies with even those physical appearance they are not familiar, and whose composition is often quite unknown to them, this complaint of the old-time chemist alchemist will be all the more interesting for the modern physician. It is evident that when Basil Valentine allows his ire to get the better of him, it is because of his indignation over the quacks who were abusing medicine and patients in his time, as they have ever since. There is a curious bit of aspersion on mere book learning in the passage that has a distinctly modern ring, and one feels the truth of Russell Lowell's expression that to read a classic, no matter how antique, is like reading a commentary on the morning paper, so up to date does genius ever remain. "And whensoever I shall have occasion to contend in the school with such a doctor, who knows not himself how to prepare his own medicines, but commits that business to another, I am sure I shall obtain the palm from him. For indeed that good man knows not what medicines he prescribes to the sick, whether the color of them be white, black, gray, or blue, he cannot tell, nor doth this wretched man know whether the medicine he gives be dry or hot, cold or humid, but he only knows that he found it so written in his books, and then pretends to acknowledge or, as it were, possession by prescription of a very long time, yet he desires to further information. Here again let it be lawful to exclaim, Good God! To what a state is the matter brought! What goodness of mind is in these men! What care do they take of the sick! Woe, woe to them! In the day of judgment they will find the fruit of their ignorance and rashness. Then they will see him who they pierced, when they neglected their neighbor, sought after money and nothing else, whereas were they cordial in their profession, they would spend nights and days in labor, that they might become more learned in their art, whence more certain health would accrue to the sick with their estimation and greater glory to themselves. But since labor is tedious to them, they commit the matter to chance, and being secure of their honor, and content with their fame, they, like brawlers, defend themselves with a certain garrulity, without any respect had to confidence or truth." Perhaps one of the reasons why Valentine's book has been of such enduring interest is that it is written in an eminently human vein and out of a lively imagination. It is full of figures relating to many other things besides chemistry, which serve to show how deeply this investigating observer was attentive to all the problems of life around him. For instance, when he wants to describe the affinity that exists between many substances in chemistry, and which makes it possible for them not to be attracted to one another, he takes a figure from the attractions that he sees exist among men and women. It is curious to find affinities discussed in our modern sense so long ago. There are some paragraphs with regard to the influence of the passion of love that one might think rather a quotation from an old-time sermon than from a great ground-breaking book in the science of chemistry. "Love leaves nothing entire or sound in man. It impedes his sleep. He cannot rest either day or night. It takes off his appetite, that he hath no disposition either to meat or drink, by reason of the continual torments of his heart and mind. It deprives him of all providence, hence he neglects his affairs, vocation, and business. He minds neither study, labor, nor prayer, casts away all thoughts of anything but the body beloved. This is his study, this his most vain occupation. If to lovers the success be not answerable to their wish, or so soon and prosperously as they desire, how many melancholies henceforth arise, with griefs and sadness, with which they pine away and wax so lean as they have scarcely any flesh cleaving to the bones. Yea, at last they lose the life itself, as may be proved by many examples. For such men, which is a horrible thing to think of, cite and neglect all perils and detriments, both of the body and life, and of the soul and eternal salvation." It is evident that human nature is not different in our sophisticated 20th century from that which this observant old monk saw around him in the 15th. He continues, "How many testimonies of this violence which is in love are daily found? For it not only inflames the younger sort, but it so far exaggerates some persons far gone in years, as though the burning heat thereof, they are almost mad. Natural diseases are for the most part governed by the complexion of man, and therefore invade some more fiercely, others more gently, but love, without distinction of poor or rich, young or old, seizeth all, and having seized, so blinds them, as forgetting all rules of reason, they neither see nor hear any snare." But then the old monk thinks that he has said enough about this rather foreign subject, and apologizes for his digression in another paragraph that should remove any lingering doubt there might be with regard to the geniuses of his monastic character. At the end of the passage he makes the application in a very few words. The personal element in his confession is so naive and so simply straightforward that instead of seeming to be the result of conceit, which would surely have repelled the reader, it rather attracts and enhances his kindly feeling for its author. The paragraph would remind one in certain ways of that personal element that was to become more popular in literature after Montaigne in the next century made it rather the fashion. "But of these enough, for it becomes not a religious man to insist too long upon these cogitations, or to give place to such a flame in his heart. Hitherto, while boasting I speak it, I have throughout the whole course of my life kept myself safe and free from it, and I pray and invoke God to vouchsafe me his grace that I may keep holy and inviolate the faith which I have sworn, and live contented with my spiritual spouse, the Holy Catholic Church. For no other reason have I alleged these than I might express the love with which all tinctures ought to be moved towards metals, if ever they be admitted by them into true friendship, and by love, which permeates the innermost parts, be converted into a better state." The application of the figure at the end of his long digression is characteristic of the period in which he wrote, as also to a considerable extent of the German literary methods of the time. In this volume on the use of antimony there are in most of the editions certain biographical notes, which have sometimes been accepted as authentic, but oftener rejected. According to these, Basil Valentine was born in Alsace, on the southern bank of the Rhine. As a consequence of this, there are several towns that have laid claim to being his birthplace. M. Jean Renaud, the distinguished French philosophical writer of the first half of the 19th century, once said that Basil Valentine, like Ossian and Homer, had many towns claim him years after his death. He also suggested that, like those old poets, it was possible that the writings sometimes attributed to Basil Valentine were really the work not of one man, but of several individuals. There are, however, many objections to this theory, the most forcible of which is the internal evidence derived from the books themselves, showing similarities of style and method of treating subjects too great for us to admit non-identity in the writers. M. Renaud lived at a time when it was all the fashion to suggest that old works that had come down to us, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, and even such national epics as the Cid and the Arthur legends and the Nibelungenlied, were to be attributed to several writers than to one. We have passed that period of criticism, however, and have reverted to the idea of single authorship for these works, and the same conclusion has been generally come to with regard to the writings attributed to Basil Valentine. Other biographic details contained in The Triumphal Chariot of Antimony were undoubtedly more correct. According to them, Basil Valentine traveled in England and Holland on missions for his order, and went through France and Spain on a pilgrimage to St. James of Compostela. Besides this work, there is a number of other books of Basil Valentine's, printed during the first half of the 16th century, that are well known, and copies of which may be found in most of the important libraries. The United States Surgeon General's Library at Washington contains not a few of the works on medical subjects, and the New York Academy of Medicine Library has some valuable editions of certain of his works. Some of his other well-known books, each of which is a good-sized octavo volume, bear the following descriptive titles. I give them in English, though as they are usually found, they are in Latin, 16th century translations of the original German. The World in Miniature, or The Mystery of the World and of Human Medical Science, published at Mayburg, 1609. The Chemical Apocalypse, or The Manifestation of Artificial Chemical Compounds, published in Erfurt in 1624. A chemico-philosophic treatise concerning things natural and preternatural, especially relating to the metals and the minerals, published at Frankfurt in 1676. Heliography, or The Science of Salts, a treatise on the preparation, use, and chemical properties of all of the mineral, animal, and vegetable salts, published at Bologna in 1644. The 12 Keys of Philosophy, Leipzig, 1630. These are of interest to the chemist and physicist rather than to the physician, and it is as a maker of medicine that we are concerned with Valentine here. The great attention aroused in Basil Valentine's work at the Renaissance period can be best realized from the number of manuscript copies and their wide distribution. His books were not all printed at one place, but, on the contrary, in different portions of Europe. The original edition of The Triumphal Chariot of Antimony was published in Leipzig at the early part of the 16th century. The first editions of the other books, however, appeared at places so distant from Leipzig as Amsterdam and Bologna, while various cities of Germany, as Erfurt and Frankfurt, claim the original editions of still other works. Many of the manuscript copies still exist in various libraries in Europe, and while there is no doubt that some unimportant additions to the supposed works of Basil Valentine have come from the attribution to him of scientific treatises of other German writers, the style and the method of the principal works mentioned is entirely too similar not to have been the fruit of a single mind, and that possessed of a distinct investigating genius, setting it far above any of its contemporaries in scientific speculation and observation. The most interesting feature of all of Basil Valentine's writings that are extant is a distinctive tendency to make his observations of special practical utility. His studies in antimony were made mainly with the idea of showing how that substance might be used in medicine. He did not neglect to point out other possible uses, however, and knew the secret of the employment of antimony in order to give sharpness and definition to the impression produced by metal types. It would seem as though he was the first scientist to discuss this subject, and there is even some question of whether printers and type founders did not derive their ideas in this matter from our chemist. Interested though he was in the transmutation of metals, he never failed to try to find and suggest some medicinal use for all of the substances that he investigated. His was no greedy search for gold, and no culmination of investigations with the idea of benefiting only himself. Mankind was always in his mind, and perhaps there is no better demonstration of his fulfillment of the character of the monk than this constant solicitude to benefit others by every bit of investigation that he carried out. For him, with medieval nobleness of spirit, "The first part of every work must be the invocation of God, and the last, though no less important than the first, must be the utility and fruit for mankind that can be derived from it." The career of the last of the makers of medicine in the Middle Ages may be summed up briefly in a few sentences that show how thoroughly this old Benedictine was possessed of the spirit of modern science. He believed in observation as the most important source of medical knowledge. He valued clinical experience far above book information. He insisted on personal acquaintanceship on the part of the physician with the drugs he used, and thought nothing more unworthy of a practitioner of medicine. Indeed, he sets it down as almost criminal, than to give remedies of whose composition he was not well aware, and whose effect he did not thoroughly understand. He thought that nature was the most important aid to the physician, much more important than drugs, though he was the first to realize the significance of chemical affinities, and he seems to have understood rather well how individual often were the effects obtained from drugs. He was a patient student, a faithful observer, a writer who did not begrudge time and care to the composition of large books on medicine, yet withal he was no dry-as-dust scholar, but eminently human in his sympathies with ailing humanity, and a strenuous upholder of the dignity of the profession to which he belonged. Scarcely more can be said of anyone in the history of medicine, at least so far as good intentions go, though many accomplish more. None deserve more honor than the Thuringian monk whom we know as Basil Valentine. There are many other of these old-time makers of medicine of whom nearly the same thing can be said. Basil Valentine is only one of a number of men who worked faithfully and did much both for medical science and professional life during the 1,000 years from the fall of Rome to the fall of Constantinople, when, according to what used to be commonly accepted opinion, men were not animated by the spirit of research and of fine incentive to do good to men that we are so likely to think of as belonging exclusively to more modern times. A man whom he greatly influenced, Paracelsus, took up the tradition of scientific investigation where Basil Valentine had left it. His work, though more successfully revolutionary, was not done in such a fine spirit of sympathy with humanity nor with that simplicity of life and purity of intention that characterized the old monk's work. Paracelsus' birth in the year of the discovery of America places him among the makers of the foundations of our modern medicine, and he will be treated of in a volume on The Forefathers in Medicine. End of Part 2 of 2. End of Chapter 14.